Chapter 1. A Quiet Home Life. In a quiet suburban home, Steve, a 6-year-old ginger cat, lounged atop a plush cushion by the window. His brown eyes, half shut in contentment, reflected the lazy morning sunlight. The air was warm and still, filled with the faint aroma of Sarah's brewing coffee. Sarah, Steve's owner, adored her feline companion, despite his stubborn demeanor and growing waistline. Steve was accustomed to luxury. His days were filled with naps, gourmet meals, and the occasional glance out the window at a world he had no desire to explore. His life was predictable, exactly the way he liked it.
Steve, breakfast is ready.
Sarah's voice echoed from the kitchen. With a reluctant stretch, Steve ambled toward his food bowl where his father, Ted, already waited. Ted, a grizzled gray tabby of 17 years, had the look of a seasoned warrior. His sharp green eyes missed nothing, and his tales of life outdoors often filled the kitchen during breakfast.
"Late again, son,"
Ted said with a flick of his tail. Steve ignored him, diving into his bowl of gourmet tuna pate. Between bites, he mumbled,
"What's the rush, Dad? Life's about enjoying the moment."
Ted chuckled softly but shook his head.
"You're too soft, Steve. One day, this cozy life might not be here, and you'll need to know how to fend for yourself."
Steve licked his whiskers and shrugged.
Why worry about what might happen when everything is perfect now?
Ted said nothing, but his gaze lingered on his son. Steve might dismiss his words today, but Ted had a feeling that life had its own way of teaching lessons. Steve finished his breakfast and retreated to his cushion, curling up for another nap. From his spot near the window, Ted watched him with a mix of pride and concern. Steve was clever, but cleverness wasn't always enough. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Journey. Preparations for Sarah's Arctic trip filled the cozy home with excitement. Her bags, neatly packed with warm clothes and supplies, stood by the door. Steve observed the commotion with mild curiosity from his cushion. The world outside didn't interest him, but the open suitcase looked like an irresistible invitation.
Steve, don't even think about it.
Sarah warned, catching his eye as she zipped the final bag. Steve stretched lazily, pretending to lose interest, but as soon as Sarah stepped out of the room, his curiosity got the better of him. The suitcase, with its soft clothes and mysterious smells, seemed like the perfect place for a nap. With a well-practiced leap, Steve landed inside, curling up into the corner. Minutes turned into hours, and Steve's nap deepened. He didn't notice when Sarah returned, closed the suitcase, and loaded it into the car. When Sarah arrived at her Arctic destination, the cold wind greeted her with a sharp bite. She shivered but smiled, eager to start her adventure. Dragging her luggage into the camp, she opened the suitcase to unpack. And there, nestled among scarves and sweaters, was Steve, blinking sleepily.
Steve, what are you doing here?
Sarah exclaimed, her voice a mix of shock and disbelief. The ginger cat stretched, unimpressed by her reaction. The long journey had been bumpy and uncomfortable, and Steve wasn't in the mood for scolding.
Oh no,
Sarah muttered, pacing.
you were supposed to stay home with Ted. What am I going to do?
Steve yawned and hopped out of the suitcase, ignoring her panic. The strange smells of the camp intrigued him, and the chill in the air was unlike anything he'd ever felt. Despite Sarah's protests, Steve began exploring the small, canvas-walled shelter.
You can't just wander off here, Steve.
Sarah said, lifting him back onto a blanket.
The Arctic isn't safe for a cat like you?
But Steve's curiosity was piqued. The soft snow, the crisp air, and the unfamiliar sounds outside the tent filled him with a sense of adventure he hadn't known he was capable of. For the first time, Steve felt a faint thrill about leaving the comfort of home. Chapter 3. Into the Snow. Steve's first step outside the tent was tentative. His paws sank into the soft, cold snow, and a shiver ran through his plump body. The Arctic was stark and alien, a world of endless white stretching in all directions. Yet despite the icy wind biting at his fur, Steve felt an undeniable pull to explore.
Steve, get back here.
Sarah called, clutching her coat tightly as she hurried after him. But Steve was already captivated by his surroundings. His paw prints trailed across the snow as he wandered farther from the camp. The snow beneath him crunched softly, and the vast, open sky above seemed endless. It wasn't long before Steve stumbled upon something extraordinary. A herd of reindeer grazing on patches of lichen exposed beneath the snow. Their large antlers cast intricate shadows on the ground, and their gentle movements were mesmerizing. One of the reindeer, a young calf, approached Steve cautiously.
"You're not from here, are you?"
The calf asked in a curious tone. Steve puffed up slightly, trying to appear confident despite his shivering.
I'm Steve. I came here accidentally. What are you?
The calf chuckled.
"I'm Nico, and these are my family. We're reindeer."
The herd regarded Steve with mild amusement, though their kindness was evident. Nico's mother stepped forward.
You shouldn't be out here alone. It's dangerous for someone so small and unaccustomed to the cold.
I'm not small.
Steve retorted, though his trembling legs betrayed him.
Even so,
Nico's mother said gently,
you'll need warmth and food to survive here. Come with us for a while. We'll help you.
Steve hesitated, glancing back at the camp, which was now barely visible in the distance. A pang of worry for Sarah tugged at him, but his stubborn curiosity pushed him forward. Chapter 4. Lost in the Blizzard. The reindeer led Steve to a sheltered grove, where the wind was less fierce. They shared stories of the Arctic, of the long winters, the northern lights, and the resilience needed to thrive in such a harsh place. Steve listened intently, his fur fluffed against the cold. But as the day wore on, the weather changed abruptly. Dark clouds rolled in, and a fierce blizzard swept across the tundra. Snow whipped around them, obscuring visibility. The reindeer huddled together, but Steve, unfamiliar with such storms, panicked and ran.
"Steve, wait!"
Nico shouted, but the swirling snow swallowed the sound. Steve stumbled blindly through the storm, the icy wind stinging his face and freezing his paws. He quickly realized he had no idea where he was or how to get back. Panic surged through him as the world turned into an endless white void. Finally, exhausted, Steve collapsed under a small overhang of ice. His body shook with cold, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his father's warnings. The world outside his cozy home was indeed dangerous, and he was utterly unprepared for it. Chapter 5. A Polar Friend. When Steve awoke, the storm had passed, and the world was eerily quiet. Opening his eyes, he found himself nose to nose with a massive polar bear.
"Ah, you're awake."
The bear said in a deep, rumbling voice.
"You're lucky I found you. You'd have frozen out here."
Steve scrambled backward, his fur puffing in alarm.
Who are you?
The bear chuckled.
"My name is Bjorn. I live in these parts. And you, little one, are far from where you belong."
Steve's pride flared despite his fear.
I'm not little, and I can take care of myself.
Bjorn raised an amused eyebrow.
"Is that so? Then how did you end up alone in the middle of a blizzard?"
Steve's ears flattened.
I got lost, he admitted grudgingly.
Bjorn nodded.
"That's what I thought. Come with me. I'll help you find your way back."
Though Steve was hesitant, he realized he had little choice. Bjorn's massive frame provided both warmth and protection as they began their journey across the snow-covered landscape. Chapter 6. Meeting the Arctic Foxes. As they traveled, Bjorn led Steve to a rocky outcrop where a family of Arctic foxes made their home. The foxes were small and quick, their white fur blending seamlessly with the snow.
Bjorn, who's your friend?
One of the foxes asked, tilting her head.
This is Steve.
Bjorn said.
He's a visitor to the Arctic and needs help finding his way home.
The foxes welcomed Steve warmly, offering him a share of the food they had gathered. Though the dried fish was far from his usual gourmet meals, Steve ate gratefully, his hunger overriding his pickiness. The foxes shared tales of their own adventures, teaching Steve about survival in the Arctic. He listened with growing respect, realizing how resourceful they were.
You're braver than I thought.
Steve admitted to Bjorn that evening.
And you're learning faster than I expected.
Bjorn replied with a smile. Chapter 7. A Midnight Encounter. The night grew colder as Steve and Bjorn journeyed further across the tundra, the pale moonlight reflecting off the endless snow. Steve's paws had begun to ache from the cold, but he was determined to keep up with Bjorn. The polar bear had been kind to him, showing him the ropes of surviving in such a harsh world. Still, Steve couldn't shake the worry about Sarah.
What if she's looking for me?
Steve said, his voice tinged with concern.
She's likely worried, yes.
Bjorn said gently.
But you mustn't rush. The Arctic is a dangerous place, and you're not ready to face it alone. But don't worry. Together, we'll find your way back.
As they traveled, the quiet night was broken by a distant, eerie sound, almost like a soft, mournful cry. Steve's ears pricked up, and he glanced nervously at Bjorn.
Do you hear that?
Steve asked. Bjorn paused for a moment, listening intently.
Yes, I do. It's a wolf.
Before Steve could ask what a wolf was, they were interrupted by the appearance of a large silver wolf with gleaming blue eyes. The creature was lean and agile, its movements graceful despite the harsh weather.
What brings you to this part of the world?
The wolf asked, its voice both curious and cautious. Bjorn's eyes narrowed.
We're on a journey. This young one is lost and needs to find his way back home.
The wolf studied Steve for a moment, sensing the feline's unease.
You've traveled far from home, little one. What do you seek?
I want to go back to my owner.
Steve said, his voice firm but quiet.
But I'm not sure how to find her.
The wolf nodded.
You will find your way. The Arctic has a way of guiding those with courage.
Bjorn growled softly.
He's not used to the cold, and he has no experience with the dangers of this place. I'll guide him.
The wolf smiled, her eyes gleaming with wisdom.
We all have our paths. May the winds be in your favor.
Then, without another word, the wolf disappeared back into the night, her silhouette blending with the snow. Chapter 8. The Call of the Wild. The next few days were a blur of cold winds, endless snow, and quiet conversations. As they traveled, Bjorn and Steve encountered more creatures of the Arctic, each offering their help in their own way. One day, they came across a small group of snowy owls perched in the trees. Their large, round eyes watched them silently, and one owl, an elderly female, glided down to greet them.
You're a long way from home, little one.
She said, her voice soft but knowing. Steve lifted his head proudly.
I'll get back. I'm learning how to survive out here.
The owl blinked slowly.
The Arctic teaches many things, but not all of them are easy lessons. You must have patience. The world here moves slowly, like the snowflakes that drift down from the sky.
Steve considered her words as Bjorn nudged him forward.
She's right.
The bear said. In the Arctic, patience is a virtue. As they continued on, Steve found himself reflecting more on what he had learned. The wilds of the Arctic were beautiful, but they were also unforgiving. He was no longer the pampered cat from home. Here, every step, every decision counted. Chapter 9. The Storm Returns. One evening, as Steve and Bjorn made camp near a glacier, the weather began to turn. The sky darkened and the wind picked up, howling through the ice-covered landscape. Steve's fur bristled as he felt the familiar bite of cold. They had barely set up their shelter when a full-fledged blizzard enveloped them.
This way!
Bjorn called, leading Steve to a nearby cave carved into the side of the glacier. Inside, the air was warmer, protected from the storm. They huddled together for warmth.
I don't like this.
Steve said, his voice filled with unease.
What if I can't find Sarah?
Bjorn gave him a reassuring look.
You will. Sometimes the path seems uncertain, but trust in your instincts. And remember, you're not alone. We'll find a way through this.
As the storm raged outside, Steve curled up next to the bear, his thoughts drifting to Sarah. He wished he could be back in his warm, familiar home. But there was something in his heart now, a sense of bravery and resilience he hadn't known he had before. Chapter 10. A Path Revealed. The storm passed by morning, and the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the snow. Bjorn and Steve emerged from their shelter, their breath visible in the chilly air.
It's time to go,
Bjorn said.
The storm's over, and the winds are shifting. I can feel it.
Steve felt a stirring of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were getting closer to Sarah. As they traveled through the snowy expanse, Bjorn led the way with certainty. Steve's paws were sore, and his stomach rumbled with hunger, but the promise of finding Sarah kept him going. The landscape began to change, the endless white of the tundra giving way to small hills and patches of green, a sign that they were nearing the more temperate zones of the Arctic. It was then that Steve saw something in the distance, a familiar shape, like the shadow of a large figure moving through the snow.
Bjorn, look!
Steve cried, pointing with his paw. Bjorn squinted into the distance, his eyes narrowing.
I see it too. It's a person.
Steve's heart leaped. Could it be Sarah? Could he finally be getting back to her? Chapter 11. Reunion. As they approached the figure, Steve's heart raced. His paws ached, his fur was matted with ice, but he pushed forward, driven by the hope that it was Sarah. And then, as if by magic, the figure turned around. It was Sarah. Her eyes widened in surprise as she saw Steve emerge from the snow, walking confidently at Bjorn's side.
Steve! Oh my goodness, how did you…
Sarah gasped, dropping to her knees and scooping him up into her arms. Steve purred loudly, nuzzling her face with relief and happiness.
I knew I'd find you.
He said, his voice full of pride.
I wasn't lost for long.
Bjorn stepped back, a small smile on his face.
I told you he had courage,
he said softly, before turning and walking back into the wilderness.
Thank you, Bjorn.
Steve called after him, but the polar bear was already gone. Sarah held Steve close, her heart filled with gratitude and love. She had feared the worst, but was overjoyed to be reunited with her adventurous cat.
We'll never be apart again, I promise.
Sarah whispered, as the Arctic winds began to calm. Chapter 12. Homeward Bound. With the storm behind them and the wilderness now a thing of the past, Sarah and Steve began their journey back home, their bond stronger than ever before. The world of the Arctic had been harsh, but it had taught Steve something invaluable: courage, resilience, and the knowledge that no matter how far you wander, love and home will always find their way to you. The end of one journey marked the beginning of another, and Steve knew he would always carry the lessons of the Arctic with him, wherever he went. Chapter 13. Return to Familiarity. After several days of travel, the stark whiteness of the Arctic landscape gradually gave way to more familiar terrain. The vast, icy expanse was replaced by the rolling hills of the tundra, and the snow began to thin, revealing patches of grass and rock. Steve felt a sense of warmth return to his bones as the cold of the north receded. Sarah, still cradling Steve in her arms, looked down at him with a smile.
We're almost there, little one.
She said softly.
Almost home.
Steve purred contentedly, enjoying the closeness to Sarah once again. Though the Arctic had taught him many things about survival, courage, and patience, he couldn't help but long for the comfort of home. The soft cushions, the familiar smells of his food, and the cozy warmth of his bed were all awaiting him.
I'm glad to be going home.
Steve admitted, his voice muffled by Sarah's warm coat.
It's been an adventure. But it's nice to have a place I belong.
Sarah chuckled.
I can't wait to see Ted again. I'm sure he's been wondering where you've been. He's probably missing you just as much.
The thought of Ted made Steve smile, and though they had been apart for some time, Steve knew their bond would be as strong as ever. His father had been a fierce protector, and while Steve had been on this wild journey, he knew Ted would be proud of him, proud of how far he'd come. Chapter 14. Farewell to the Arctic. When Steve woke up the next morning at Sarah's camp, he felt the warmth of her presence. Although exhausted from his adventures, his heart was at peace. Sarah was preparing for the journey home, packing her gear and chatting with other members of the expedition. Steve sensed that his time in the Arctic was coming to an end, but he knew he would leave part of himself there. Memories of the incredible creatures he had met. Meanwhile, Bjorn and the reindeer appeared at the edge of the camp to bid their little friend goodbye. Steve, who had learned so much during this adventure, approached them with gratitude.
I don't know how to thank you.
He said, looking up at Bjorn.
Without you, I would have never made it back.
It was our pleasure, Steve.
Replied the polar bear, his deep voice calm and kind.
But remember, the real strength came from within you. We only helped you discover it.
The reindeer added their farewells, and one of them, small and full of energy, said,
We'll miss your stories, Steve. Maybe one day you'll visit our land again?
Steve smiled, knowing he would always have friends in the Arctic.
If I ever return, I'll find you.
He replied, waving his paw. The journey back. As the plane soared above the snow-covered wilderness, Steve watched the Arctic from the window. Sarah held him on her lap, hugging him tightly.
What a surprise you've been, Steve.
She said with a soft laugh.
But I'm so glad everything turned out fine.
Steve, though unable to respond in human words, purred, his way of expressing that he understood everything. He knew this experience had changed him forever, teaching him courage, openness, and gratitude for every moment in life. On the plane, he thought about Ted, waiting for him back home. Steve couldn't wait to share his adventures with his father. He knew Ted would be surprised but also proud of his son, who had discovered a completely different world and returned as a more experienced cat. Homecoming. When Sarah and Steve arrived at the family home, the door swung open and Ted stood in the doorway. His amber eyes gleamed, and his tail flicked slightly as he looked at his returning son.
Steve,
He called, approaching him.
how on earth did you manage to survive so long out there?
Steve proudly began recounting his adventures, his trek through the snow, the reindeer, and Bjorn, the challenges he had overcome. Ted listened intently, nodding occasionally.
I'm proud of you, son.
He said at last.
You've learned more than I could have ever taught you at home.
Steve felt truly appreciated. Although he valued his comfortable life, he knew the experiences he had in the Arctic were priceless. As they sat together on the soft couch, Ted leaned over to him and said,
You know, Steve, sometimes it's worth taking risks to discover something new. But remember, always come back home. This is where you belong.